3 true paranormal October scary stories. Get ready for a spine-tingling experience. This is Mr. H with Masked Horror. Let's get into it. The disappearing neighbor. I moved into my little suburban house about a year ago. It was perfect. Quiet street, friendly neighbors, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Across the street from me lived Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman. She was one of those old school types, always tending to her garden or sitting on her porch in the afternoons. She'd wave whenever I passed by, and I'd wave back, but that was about the extent of our interactions. That all changed a few months ago. It was mid-August when I first noticed something was off. I hadn't seen Mrs. Patterson in a few days. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was old. Maybe she wasn't feeling well, or maybe she was visiting family. But as the days passed, it struck me how unusual it was. She was always outside, like clockwork. Her garden, her pride and joy, was starting to look neglected, the flowers wilting, weeds creeping up. I asked my other next-door neighbor if he had seen her recently. He looked surprised. He said he didn't know who that was, which was strange because the type of neighborhood we lived in, everyone knew everyone to some extent, even if it was just a face. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Mrs. Patterson was the type who never left her house for more than a day or two. No one had seen her for weeks. I decided to call the police for a welfare check. Something wasn't right. The officers came by the next morning. I watched from my window as they knocked on her door, waited, and then knocked again. No answer. Eventually, they let themselves in. About 20 minutes later, they came back out, looking confused. I went outside to talk to them, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Ma'am, are you sure Mrs. Patterson lives here?" one of the officers asked. "Of course," I said, frowning. "She's been here for years." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before replying. "The house is completely empty. There's no sign of anyone living there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean empty?" "Like no furniture, no personal belongings, just an empty house. No one's been living here for a long time." I couldn't believe it. I told them I'd seen her just a few weeks ago, sitting on her porch like she always did. But they didn't seem convinced. They told me they'd look into it, and that was that. But I couldn't let it go. I started doing some digging on my own, looking up any information I could find about the house. And that's when I found it, the article, dated 1953. A woman had lived in that house, right across the street from where I live now. She disappeared one night, completely vanished without a trace. Her case was never solved. I felt sick. 2 women, decades apart, both vanishing in the same neighborhood. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But the more I searched, the stranger it got. I couldn't find any records of Mrs. Patterson owning or renting the house. In fact, there were no records of her at all. It was like she never existed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her, about the empty house, the random disappearance. Around midnight, I looked out my bedroom window, just across the street, and there she was. Mrs. Patterson, standing in her garden, just like I'd seen her so many times before. Only something was wrong. Her movements were slow, stiff, like she was in a daze. I ran outside, but by the time I crossed the street, she was gone. The garden was empty, and the house was dark and silent. I hadn't seen her since. The house is still empty, just as the police said. The hospital visitor. I was lucky to be alive. At least that's what the doctors kept telling me. The heart attack had come out of nowhere. I was a relatively healthy guy in my late 30s. I eat right, work out, and rarely drink or smoke, so a heart attack was crazy to me. Come to find out later that my heart attack was caused by some parasite I'd picked up on a trip abroad the kind that quickly damages your body without you even knowing. My heart gave out while I was driving. I don't remember much of the accident itself, just flashes, the screech of tires, the airbag exploding in my face, then nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed, monitors beeping, tubes hooked up to my body. The doctor said it was a miracle I'd survived the crash, let alone the heart attack. It was a week before Halloween, but I spent the next few weeks there, recovering, and that's when I met her, the old woman. I'm not sure when she first appeared. It was late at night, during one of those restless, sleepless hours when you're in too much pain to rest, but too exhausted to stay awake. She just showed up, sitting in the chair by my bed, like she belonged there. I remember thinking, she must have been someone's grandma, maybe lost her way and wandered into my room. But she wasn't confused. She was calm, collected, kind. She smiled at me, a warm, grandmotherly smile, and told me to relax, that everything would be all right. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was too drugged up to care. She sat there for a long time, talking about life, about growing old, the things you regret, the things you don't. It felt good to talk to her. She had this soothing presence, like a warm blanket. I don't know how long she stayed that first night, but when I woke up the next morning, she was gone. I assumed she had been a dream, some hallucination brought on by the meds. But then she came back, every night. She never gave me her name, and I didn't ask. It felt rude, somehow. She always talked about life in this vague, distant way, like she had seen everything there was to see. She told me not to worry, that I'd pull through this, but there was always this strange undertone in her words, like she knew something I didn't. One night, I asked her who she was visiting. She didn't answer at first, just smiled at me. Then she said, "I'm here for everyone." After that, I didn't see her again. I figured maybe she'd been discharged, maybe a family member had come to pick her up, or the person she was visiting was discharged. I never mentioned her to the nurses. She seemed harmless, just a sweet old lady who liked to talk. It wasn't until I left the hospital that I realized something was wrong. One of the nurses who took care of me while I was at the hospital also worked outside the hospital with my doctor at his private practice. I was chatting with her during a follow-up appointment, and I casually brought up the old woman. I asked how was she doing, if she was still around. The nurse gave me a confused look. "There was no one like that on your floor," she said. "Are you sure you didn't dream it?" I insisted, describing the woman in detail. The nurse's face paled. "You're not the first patient to mention her," she said quietly. A few others described seeing an old woman before they passed away, but there's never been anyone like that as far as she knew. My blood ran cold. I felt a weight settle in my chest, heavier than anything I'd felt during my recovery. I started researching, digging into old hospital records, looking for anything, any mention of her. What I found made my stomach turn. There had been reports over the years, patients seeing the same elderly woman just days before they died. And then I realized I was the only one who survived. I haven't been able to shake it since. I can still see her face, that calm, knowing smile. I know she's out there waiting. Maybe for me, maybe for someone else. But I know one thing for sure, it wasn't my time. But when she comes again, it won't be for a conversation. It'll be for something far worse. I just hope I don't see her for a very, very long time. The Phantom Caller. I can't say exactly when it started, but I remember the first call. Late at night, probably around 2 a.m. I figured it was just the wrong number. When I answered, there was no voice, just heavy breathing on the other end. It was unsettling, but I hung up and went back to sleep. No big deal, right? But the calls kept coming, same time, every night. At first I brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank, maybe a glitch in the system. But then the breathing turned into faint whispers, too soft to understand, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. I blocked number after number. but the calls kept going. I finally called my phone company to see what could be done. When I gave them the details, they told me no calls had come through, no records. That's when I felt the first real chill creep in. Something was wrong, but I tried to shake it off. I wanted to believe it was all just a technical issue, nothing more. Then the calls became more frequent. The whispers grew more intense, sometimes interrupted by soft, eerie laughter. My anxiety spiked every time the phone rang, and I couldn't sleep, waiting for it to happen again. Eventually, I called the police. I thought maybe I was being stalked. They traced the calls, but what they found was worse than anything I'd imagined. The calls were coming from my own number. The officers said it was probably someone using spoofing software, making it seem like I was calling myself, but that explanation didn't calm me down. If anything, it made me feel more paranoid. I turned off my phone at night, hoping that would stop the calls. It didn't. I'd still wake up at 2 a.m. to hear it ringing, except my phone wasn't even on. Soon, it wasn't just the calls. Lights in my apartment flickered late at night. I'd hear footsteps when I was completely still. I started locking my bedroom door, but one night, I woke up and found my front door wide open. I know I locked it before bed. I told myself I must have been imagining it. Sleep deprivation does strange things to people, right? But then, one night, I woke up to hear my own voice on the line. The whispers, the ones I'd been hearing for weeks. It wasn't some stranger. It was me. I was saying things I couldn't remember even saying, talking about things that hadn't happened yet, things that were going to happen. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it wasn't a dream. My own voice was whispering back to me, repeating things I never wanted to hear. That same night, I found deep scratches on my bedroom window, like someone or something had been trying to claw their way inside. I moved to a new apartment, but the calls followed me. It didn't matter where I went. The police stopped taking me seriously. Friends thought I was losing it, and maybe I was, but I know what I heard. I went to the doctor, desperate for answers. They're running every test imaginable, trying to figure out if it's all in my head, if something's wrong with me. I hope it's just sleep deprivation and insomnia, but deep down, I don't know what to think. It seems like a really bad dream, but unfortunately, my reality now.